Okay, fine. I realized that in talking so much about the 100 Years' War, and as a result by the victories of the French, I was kind of leaving England, the perfidious Albion, the eternal Anglo, a little bit in the shadows. So for today, what I'm going to mention for the 16th of June, 1487, 534 years ago, I can tell you that the Battle of Stokefield signed the last of the Yorkist rebellion against King Henry VII of England. This would mark the end of the War of the Roses. One of the Wars of the Roses, the essentially civil war fighting for the crown of England between the houses of the Lancaster, represented by the Red Rose, and the House of York, represented by a White Rose. It is also worth mentioning that, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, they were all just inbred. Uncles against cousins, granddaughters against grandfathers, and whatnot. So, as expected of nobility in the medieval times. And a round of applause to Henry VII, since after winning this particular War of the Roses, ended up reigning for over 22 years after that. Now, what we have to mention for the day is the new build in the PTR 39015. This is a Mythic Plus focused build. So this is what Blizzard has done with this patch. There are going to be a few things we're going to touch likely tomorrow, things that we will left out from this video, because this one is what is going to center around the Mythic Plus additions and changes. Now let's start with what is currently available in game for everyone to compare with, which is the dungeon nerfs and fixes, so to speak. So as it stands, Blizzard is nerfing Dealer Zayaxa. From the other side, it's also nerfing Akar, it's nerfing Amarth from Necrotic Wake, it's nerfing Crixis from Sanguine Depths. Now, when it comes to Dealer Zayaxa, they are going to change the Arcane Lightning, together with the Arcane Vulnerability debuff that follows. Arcane Lightning is going to be doing roughly 20% less damage, as well as Arcane Vulnerability is no longer going to constantly stack up your arcane damage taken over time. Instead, it's just going to be a flat 5% damage increase. It's not going to stack to those insane levels to the point where you're going to have to precisely bounce this debuff to different players to prevent this one basically two-shotting a DPS or a healer eventually, if you let it linger long enough. Then we have the drastic change to Hakar. So, for those who are not familiar with Hakar, more importantly for people who have always done Hakar without a single clue of how the boss fight works, he has an ability called Blood Barrier. He also has energy that he gains over time. One of the problems of this fight is that sometimes, especially if you lacked the DPS, he would end up creating a blood barrier, absorbing damage, while he still kept gaining energy, to the point that by the time you broke the blood barrier, Hakar had gained enough energy to cast blood barrier again and shield himself again. This could create an endless loop, a very dangerous loop, where you simply didn't have the room, didn't have the time, the window to just damage the damn boss, and you were always stuck on damaging this shield. The change that is being applied to Hakar is that Blood Barrage, rather than being a 14-second long effect, which is going to continue during Blood Barrier, now instead is going to be until cancelled. Now, what does this mean? This means that Blood Barrage is essentially going to be a channeled effect throughout the barrier. This means that when Hakar goes into his shield phase, and he's basically stuck channeling Blood Barrage, you know, the pulse on the ground he keeps casting, he's not going to do anything else. He's not going to add any other mechanic to the fight, including gaining energy. So the entire change is essentially Hakar is no longer going to gain energy once he casts Blood Barrier. Only after you broke the Blood Barrier he's going to be able to start gaining energy again. This is going to prevent that very annoying situation where you're going to be too slow to take down the Blood Barrier, and then by the time the Blood Barrier is broken, he's going to cast it again because he gained too much energy in the meantime. That is no longer going to happen. It is a particular buff to all the specs and classes that did not have any immunities, because the amount of damage done initially by Blood Barrier to the players went to turn the damage done into a shield. So people could just immune the damage taken to make the shield smaller, so it was easier to break. Now this is going to be less of a must on Akar. It's still going to be helpful, of course, but not as important. As for the other dungeons, they are much minor in terms of nerfs. Amarth from Necrotic Wake, the Tortured Echoes is going to be nerfed, so the continuous AoE, which is of course the deadliest part of Amarth, as well as making sure you deal with the ads. That is getting nerfed also by roughly 20%. And then you also have Grixis in Sanguine Depths. His charge is doing 10% less damage, as well as the essence absorption, so the orbs that you can absorb for AoE damage to the rest of the party. Then also we have gotten changes to Sanguine Depths and Halls of Atonement, except not the bosses, the actual trash mobs. Sanguine Depths has gotten changes to Explosive Anger, Explosive Rage, and Severing Slice. These are the abilities done and casted by the Remnant of Fury and the Chamber Sentinel. These are going to be the ones after the first boss, once you start doing the ring around the second boss. Explosive Anger and Explosive Rage are both getting nerfed by quite a lot. Not as much as the initial dot, which is a 20-ish% nerf, but the actual explosion at the end of the dot, which is closer to a 50% nerf. So it's very significant. And then Severing Slice. This ability, which has been nerfed before, now is no longer going to be an AoE frontal cleave. Now Severing Slice is only going to hit the target, so the tank. Now all of the failing melee DPS are going to be able to just misposition without any threat. This is not the type of nerf I enjoy. It should be pretty self-explanatory for melee DPS to not stay in front of the enemy, not stay next to the tank, but stay behind. So this is not the type of nerfs I would like to see in a Mythic Plus key. When we talk about the melee DPS having a harder time than the range DPS, this is the bare minimum a melee DPS should keep attention to, should keep an eye to. Cleaves and frontals and things you have to dodge. That's just par for the course of playing melee, so I don't think this nerf was very much needed. Then we have a change to Halls of Atonement. This particular one is to the Shard of Alkias and the Depraved Obliterators. The Obliterators are the innocuous trash, which does nothing other than spamming Wicked Bolt, the cast ability. Now, this is the typical one that is completely irrelevant and completely ignored, all the way up to plus 17, plus 18 keys, more or less. You don't care about this cast, you don't think it's dangerous, and then you start getting into fortified keys, into a fortified 19 or something, and this motherfucker is spamming Wicked Bolt and it's doing 20k damage per cast. And you start being, fucking hell, man, this hurts. Well, Blizzard thinks it doesn't hurt enough, because Wicked Bolt is actually getting buffed by over 20%, 26%, similar to, the damage increase expected for Mythic Plus. Wicked Bolt is going to do even more damage. There has been a nerf / buff, however, to Thrash from the Shard of Alkias. So one of the cheat mechanics of Thrash is that you can simply outrange it. The range is 40 yards, so whenever there is Thrash, you can just move out of range and ignore it. Blizzard has decided to stop people from this playstyle, and instead they want people to go through this AoE. So instead now Thrash is going to be doing 25-ish, again, less damage, but the range of Thrash is now going to be 60 yards. Instead of 40. So now, actually bothering to run 60 yards away from this thing is becoming much more dangerous, particularly for the healer, who would have to out of range the tank and the melee DPS if he chooses to stay there by quite a lot. So it would be pretty risky to go through with this. Now this is a necessary adjustment, and it will likely continue, by the way, because of course with the new patch, Mythic Plus dungeons are going to be buffed in scaling. This is to account for the buff that you yourself will gain in item level. Mythic Plus will basically be buffed by 26% in damage and health. This is to account for the roughly 26 item levels you will be gaining, because you will be going from 226-ish item level from now to 252 item level of the basically max item level of 9.1. So that's 26 item level increase. 1 item level equals 1% more damage. So Mythic Plus gets buffed by 26%. Yes, this is going to create the exact same situation we have now seen for multiple seasons, which is at the very release of the new patch, Mythic Plus will feel much harder. Of course, because you are currently under-geared. Eventually, just after a couple of weeks of, spamming Mythic Plus and doing Heroic Raid and the first reset of Mythic raiding, you will start, chewing through Mythic Plus much more easily. Now, those were the changes given to the bosses and the trash mobs of the dungeons. We also have some changes to the actual affixes. Particular focus given to Storming and Necrotic. Storming is receiving a massive amount of nerfs. I don't think it was that necessary. I do think that of the ones that cock-block melee DPS the most, I don't think Storming was the issue. However, it's getting nerfed by a lot. Storming now is going to travel much more slowly. It's going to also appear to always be traveling clockwise, so you can always track the path that the Storming whirly is expected to have, and you can't be, taken off guard by its swirly and random directions. Storming's damage is also being reduced from 15% max health to 12%, and now it's going to despawn once one player gets hit by it, and it's no longer going to stay around. So yes, of course, all these changes make this much less annoying for melee DPS. However, my original point, just mentioned, is that I don't think this was one of the keys of melee DPS being at a disadvantage in Mythic Plus. I think Spiteful is much more oppressive for melee DPS than it is Storming. However, it's a good start, at least something in favor of melee DPS. The other change, which is likely going to be much bigger, is the change to Necrotic. Thrash mobs are now going to apply Necrotic at half the speed, applying Necrotic Wound on every other melee swing that connects. So, further value to classes, to specs of tanks that have a very high parry and dodge rate. So, on top of dodging Necrotic stacks because they can parry the attack or dodge the attack, now only every other hit is going to apply Necrotic. So specs that are generally hit more often and have less of parry and dodge are not going to gain as much value, but still it's a 50% nerf to Necrotic in terms of application. Not in terms of damage, not in terms of how much healing reduction it applies, but just in the terms of the speed. This is good because, as mentioned multiple times already this first few months of Shadowlands, we are in a kiting meta, so anything that can make you kite less and keep you a little bit more stationary and give some advantages to tanks that don't have the toolkit for this kiting meta is good. And Necrotic, nerfing Necrotic is a good start for that type of problem in Mythic Plus. Now, the last of the changes, after going through the in-game already existing bosses and thrash mobs being nerfed, as well as the affixes being nerfed, we also have the changes to the new thing from the PTR, which is the mini-bosses from the new AFFIX Tormented. Incinerator, Arcolath, Auros Coldheart, Executioner Varoth, and Sogodon the Breaker have gotten expanded in their ability pool. Now, most of these were rather harmless and innocuous compared to what could be expected of them. If you compare these four to basically the spawns of Prideful, right? First of all, Prideful spawns 5 times. These are 4, so you already have 1 less, but also Prideful was just more dangerous than these guys. Now, Incinerator Arcolath is going to be buffed in doing more damage in its main, spammable ability, as the AoE, the continuous AoE, is going to be doing Soulforged Flames, and also it has gotten Inferno. It's going to be a very large AoE with a 60-yard range, so very unlikely you will be able to just run away from this, doing quite a lot of damage. The base damage shows to be about 15,000 on a +10 keystone. Now, it doesn't seem there is any special thing you need to be doing, spread to take less damage or stack to share the damage. You're just going to have to just take it in the face with a defensive or a healer cooldown, that's all. Auros Coldheart is also going to get an extra ability, which is Cold Snap. Executioner Varoth is going to have a pretty annoying spread and stack wave of mechanics. Not only his base default aura is to cut the healing received by 50%, he's going to have a cycle of Raise and Wave of Terror. Raise is the ability which is going to do very high damage to the main target and all the nearby target, leaving a bleed on everyone next to the main target, and then Wave of Terror is going to be the AoE, which is going to fear players if they are not within 8 yards of each other. If you want to be very precise, the range of Raise is only 5 yards, so the range of the bleed around the main target is only 5 yards, whereas the range of the fear is 8 yards. So technically, you have a 3-yard room that you can stay in without getting hit by the bleed, although it's a very tiny room for you to make this. You're much better off just staying away from the tank and then stacking for the wave, and then going back to your normal position. Then, lastly, you have Sogodon the Breaker, which was basically, funnily enough, named the Breaker. He was broken himself. He wasn't doing much of anything before. So he still has his Crush, which is your normal run-of-the-mill tank buster. After all, his aura, his passive, is going to be increasing physical damage taken by 50% for all players. He also has a passive on Crush, which is gripping the target up to 60-yard range away and just throwing him back in front of him. This is an anti-kite mechanic, so Blizzard has learned from what happened in Awakened in BFA, where the tank breaker could just be perma-kited, and the tank really never had to bother. Well, now you can't, because he's just gonna grip you back and crush you anyways. So you have to deal with this tank buster somehow. He's also gonna periodically pull Seismic Wave, which is going to be an AoE damage, physical damage for all the party. Again, 60-yard range, so very difficult to outrange. And then finally, his special ability, his ultimate, we could say, is Massive Smash. He is going to grip all players into melee, rooting them with Bindings of Misery, and then start casting Massive Smash, which is pretty much going to be a one-shot on anyone that's not a tank. You have to break the bindings that are rooting you, and then escape the AoE, the circle AoE around them. Root breaking abilities like Shape-Shifting or Blessing of Freedom can still work, so you're gonna be able to save some players with that, otherwise you just have to damage. No, these bindings are not personal, so it's not that you yourself have to deal with your own binding only. You can just AoE them all down as a DPS, for example. You can help, for example, the healer breaking out of his own roots. And once that's done, you go back to the normal rotation of single target, heavy hit on the tank, and AoE on the rest of the group, and repeat. Those are going to be the 4 mini-bosses available to you in the new Affix, and those were all the changes so far centered around Mythic Plus. Tomorrow, we are gonna go over some of the extra additions to the Sylvanas fight. We now have more details on the whole encounter, including the Mythic version, as well as her weapon, which is also going to drop in Heroic, her legendary weapon, as well as the balance tuning that is happening, which I've not kept for first because it's not as major, it's not as important compared to the Mythic Plus changes. No, it's not because survival is being buffed. I'm not biased that way, there is just less changes, so we're gonna keep it for later. Thank you guys anyways for watching the video. If you have enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel, subscribe, etc, blah blah blah. If you don't, I am not gonna judge, but I kind of will, though. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I don't know, man, it's middle of June, and it's 33 degrees here. I think it's kind of overboard, honestly.